My dear students, today we will discuss about imperialism in South Asia. Hope you all have gone through my previous lecture on geopolitical and strategic significance of South Asia. So after that lecture today, I'll deliver uh, another lecture on imperialism in South Asia, and along with imperialism, to some extent I'd also like to highlight about how as a result of imperialism this colonial forces, this colonial masters came to this part of the world. So let us start discussions. uh, you know as you all know about different empires, in an ancient period in this part of the world. For example, you have heard about Mauryan Empire, then this Mughal Empire, and in a far, the western side, you heard about this Roman Empire as well. So these were the empires, in the ancient period in different parts of the world in general, and particularly this Mauryan Empire and Mughal Empire. These were the empire in this part of the world, specifically in this Indian subcontinent. But there's a slight difference between those empires and this modern version of this imperialisms. This modern version of imperialism, that is absolutely a kind of new phenomena, and it was developed from the capitalism which emerged in Europe after the industrial revolutions. This industrial As a result of this industrial revolution, this industrial capitalism, the very idea of industrial capitalisms came into existence, and this industrial capitalism exported the finished goods from the European countries to the distant colonies through oceanic routes and imported raw materials necessary for the manufacture of these goods. Its European country competitively produced more than what was necessary for its consumption, and this caused the tough commercial competitions among the European countries. This search for the markets led to the colonization, specifically in this Afro-Asian and this American the regions. But in these particular discussions, I'd basically like to highlight, how this modern version of this imperial forces came specifically to this South Asian context, and how they became successful in establishing different sorts of colonies. And this particular process started, long before this 20th century, specifically from 19th centuries. As a result of this industrial revolution from 18th centuries in Europe, there's a kind of tough competitions between different European superpowers, specifically the imperial forces like this United Kingdom, that means this British forces. Then we have this France, and Portuguese, specifically. We have this four specific uh, this modern imperialist forces. They became more successful in stabilizing and establishing colonies in different parts of the world, namely those of British colonialism, this French colonialism, this Portuguese colonialisms, and this Dutch. But apart from those, this four this imperialist forces, there are other imperialist forces as well, who established different colonies, not only in the context of Asia, but in Africa and other parts of the world as well. uh, so in that way, these different sorts of imperial forces came to this part of the world. This South Asia, it's invited, it's attract the peoples of different parts of the world, only because of the simple reason is that this Southeast is considered to be the treasurer of the wealth, this natural resources, the minerals, you know it's and everything, this from the butterflies to the elephant, from these pearls to these different sorts of coals and other minerals as well, which are available in this part of the world. And along with that, in this part of the world have the scenic beauties, these Himalayan plateaus, which combined the Southeast into the under the the common platform, on the basis of which this Southeastern country shares common characters, common physical characters, common geographical characters. They share different sorts of cultural practices as well. So, from the time of those empires, namely these Mauryan emperors, Mughal emperors, which became successful in establishing the empire in this part of the world, who played a very significant role in stabilizing the the socializing process in this part of the world. But slowly and gradually, from the 19th centuries onwards, the kind of modern imperialism which developed, in the European regions, then transmigrated from these European regions to the rest of the world as a result of huge competition among themselves. And this imperialism also, occupied this South Asian region. So I do believe that you all know about the emergence of working class movement, along with the growth of capitalism in the West. This growth of working class movement forced the capitalists to accede to some of their demands. Besides, the cost of transportation of raw materials from and finished products to far off colonies increased. Thus, the profit of the capitalists began to diminish. This led capitalism to a crisis, and the attempts made to overcome this crisis led to the development of imperialisms. That means, in the Western societies, there was a kind of, contestation among different sorts of capitalistic forces due to the crisis of, raw materials and many more things. So, in order to capture, the rest of the regions, to use those regions as a kind of uh, you know uh, the facilitator of raw materials, they try to engulf those regions. So in that way, these capitalistic forces developed that particular imperialistic tendencies, because until and unless the capitalist forces develop a territorial instinct, annexation of territories, in terms of annexing territory others territories, they cannot no longer considered as a imperial forces. So these capitalist forces can be considered as the imperial forces, because these capitalist forces slowly and gradually they try to annex other territories. As for example, these African territories, these Asian territories, they try to annex other territories, other regions as well, so that they can use those regions as their colonies. And in that way, these imperial forces came to this part of the world. So when capitalism developed into imperialism, it also faced a new crisis. That is, capitalists of particular countries that have to compete among themselves. And the tension also arose between the capitalist and working class. To control world market, competition arose, and as a result of that, that is the outbreak of the series of wars. This conflict arose between the capitalist countries and among the colonized people. This was the background of the liberation struggle which occurred in the colonies. That means, subsequently, as a result of this conflict between history shows us different sorts of conflict among these capitalist countries and those colonized people. That means this in a very derogatory sense, it can be considered as a colonial masters and this colonial slave. So the clashes between these colonial masters and colonial slave took place. And subsequently, there are different sorts of liberation movements develop in different parts of the world, for which ultimately results in the form of nationalism, in some which results in the form of extremism as well. So in the context of South Asia, we have to highlight this imperialism. We have to highlight in terms of how this imperialism transformed itself into colonialism in South Asia, how this colonialism transformed itself into nationalism in South Asia, and subsequently how it's led to this extremism in South Asia. Those need to be discussed. The imperialist countries adopted many strategies to continue their policy of exploitations. The liberation movements were suppressed by military force. The colonial people were exploited through the collection of taxes, administrative measures, and judicial system. The people were intimidated and suppressed by the bureaucracy, judiciary, and the police. Literacy, arts, and local education system were either discouraged or destroyed. They were substituted by the Western system. For example, this Lord Macaulay stated that the aim of education was to bring up a new generation of people who were Indian by birth. And I'm talking about this Indian subcontinent, who were Indian by birth and color and European by attitude and race. The aim of imperialism was to create a generation in the colonies owing allegiance to Western civilizations. So it's basically proof that these imperialist forces want some sort of, the kind of categories of people who always remain loyal to this, these colonies. So in that way, this colonialisms, these imperialist forces subsequently developed the very idea of colonies. They become successful in establishing colonies in this part of the world, by suppressing the people, sometimes by, on the basis of collecting taxes, sometimes in administrative mechanisms, sometimes by, applying some sort of, legal rules and regulations as well. So this imperialisms the spread in different parts of the South Asian countries. But in order to understand the magnitude of imperialistic forces in South Asia, we also need to understand what exactly this imperialism signifies. So according to Oxford Dictionary, this imperialism is a policy of imperial rule or a system. Usually it is used in a derogatory sense to mean dominating other nations by acquiring dependencies. So this imperialist forces always tries to develop some sort of dependency syndrome on the part of the marginalized categories. That means in the receiving ends. On the basis of that, this facilitator become more dominating in characters, and they become more imperialistic in characters. Then again, this Encyclopedia Britannica mentions that the word imperialism originates from the Latin word imperium, that means power, and so empire. The word dates back to 500 BC in the Roman Empire. It was a policy of the state by which control is established beyond its borders over people generally unwilling to accept such a control. The imperialist nature of a polity is sometimes difficult to discern. So, in this way, different theorizations came into existence. In case of empire, this power appears to be the main root. The superior powers wanted to extend their territories beyond their own for either materialistic gain or to assert their superiority. Once the territory was owned, attempts were made by the victor to impose his cultural and ideological attitudes on the vanquished. This attitude is imperial attitude. That means it's a question of you can also say that it's a question of this hegemony. It's a question of not necessarily that kind of hegemony, but it's a question of cultural and ideological attitude that's shown by the victors upon the vanquished. It is a kind of superiorities. It's developed as a result of superiority. Another personality is Sapon Mazumdar, that he is of the opinion that imperialism is a natural byproduct of the meeting between two cultures. He is of the view that when two cultures meet, they necessarily arouse admiration and apprehension for each other. He also says, at times such meetings are caused by strokes of historical accidents, at others by a motivation of expansions. That means for the vanquished viewpoint, it's considered to be a kind of strokes of historical accidents, and from victors, it's a question of motivation of expansions. He get motivated to expand his territories in order to fulfill their imperialistic tendencies by dominating, by suppressing, the vanquished side. Then, according to Nadal H. Zors and Curtis Perry, by imperialism we mean the extension of sovereignty or control, whether direct or indirect, political or economic, by one government, nation, or society over another, together with the ideas justifying or opposing this process. Imperialism is essentially about power, both as end and means. That means this uh, that we had it, theoretical justification in terms of end and means. Sometimes this end justify the means. Sometimes end and means in something different. So in case of these imperialistic forces as well, you know they they try to relate this the both proverb, this end and means, in terms of fulfilling their own interests. Then again, this John Strachey asserts that the British Empire in India, in terms of this Indian subcontinent, he asserts that it was founded by violence, treachery, and insatiable avarice, but also by incomparable daring and sustained resolution. It united India, it partitioned India, it created modern India, it degraded India, it industrialized India, it stunted India, it served India, it ravaged India, it created modern India. It was selfish, selfless reunions and constructive, glorious and monstrous. Such events cannot usually be either celebrated or arranged, but perhaps they can be understood. So from this analysis, we can understand that how this imperialisms create a lot of contestations. The lot of unfolding contradiction arise as a result of this imperialism. Sometimes it look like as a result of the imperialist forces, this modern form of this South Asia, this modern version of India or Indian subcontinent, or the kind of development that took place in present day context. But at the same time, this part of the world also has been experiencing with a lot of problems, which may be related with those colonial forces or imperialist forces as well. There are many theories that try to define the motives behind imperialism. Some of them focused on economic profit as a chief motive, while others think of the availability of abundant natural resources and cheap labor. Military strategy is also one of the motives for imperialistic activities. Some of the nations in the past expanded their territories to create a buffer zone around themselves so that their own territory remain intact from the foreign attack. So in that way, if we look at the imperialistic forces, the expansion of imperialist forces in Africa, we might find that each and every dominant European countries, namely France, Germany, Italy, this United Kingdom, this Portugal, each and every countries have one or more, two or more. In this way, each and every countries have under control this African countries under the control of these countries. That means they shared, you know, two, three, each and every this dominant country shares two to three countries of their own, so that they make some sort of consensus that they can fulfill their own interest in all those colonies. So in that way, in case of Asia's as well, namely this United Kingdom and this France become more dominating in characters in terms of expanding their activities. So, in some occasions in the world history, this imperialist forces or the very idea of imperialism also came into existence. Sometimes in terms of in terms of economic profit, sometimes in terms of finding out the cheap labor, in terms of sometimes in draining the natural resources, sometimes the kind of military strategies these imperialist forces expanded their activities from one regions. Then again, imperialism may also be attributed to patriotism, religion, and cultural and racial superiority. The Europeans, for example, they consider the people of Africa and Asia, specifically Asia, as inferior, racially inferior. The lack of education and knowledge, especially industrial and technical, reinforced their cultural prejudice. Most of these imperialists believed strongly that they had a God-given mission to lift the downtrodden. This feeling can be justified, and you all know it's a white man burden theory. That means this is considered to be a burden by the white. They are considered themselves the white, and others is considered as the blacks. And since they are white, so they are civilized, they're advantageous, they are superiors. And since others are considered to be black by them, that's why, since they're black, whether it's Asian people, whether it's African people, you know, they're uncivilized, they're considered to be uncivilized, immature, illiterate, so they should be civilized. So, on the basis of that racial dominance, this racial stereotyping, these prejudices, these imperialist forces, you know, expanded their activities from their, own regions to the rest of the. So, in terms of imperialism in different parts of the world, and also in case of the South Asia, uh, we have these two basic theories: this white man burden theory, which I have already told you, and another one is the civilizational mission. That means they are in a civilizational mood. They take that particular responsibilities to civilize the uncivilized people. Because in different parts of the world, specifically in 18th and 19th centuries, more specifically in Asia, Africa, and Latin American regions, due to the lack of education, there's an increased number of superstitions. There's a huge darkness so in that sense, these European superpowers got that particular sense to show a kind of excuse of their intervention in the name of civilization. In terms of civilizing this region, they would like to intervene by spreading different sorts of missionaries activities. So we have lots of debatable issues in terms of this white man burden theory civilizational missions. If we look at this, the very idea of imperialism from theoretical perspective, this Lenin in his book, "This State and Revolution," is talking about this idea of imperialism is the last stage of capitalism, and the another, develop theories of development and underdevelopment, the theorist of development and underdevelopment, that is Rosa Luxemburg. According to Rosa Luxemburg, imperialism is the last stage for human race for capitalism. So on the basis of that, we can understand how these imperialist forces become more, exploitative in characters. The Lenin version of this imperialism, he, explained in terms of, developing the very idea of this periphery, semi-periphery, and core in terms of this international relation studies. In the version of his monopoly capitalism, how this core become more dominating in characters, and how there's a kind of always there's a kind of struggle between these peripheries and semi-peripheries, and these peripheries always remain in the back foot, and the semi-peripheries create some sort of impressions, but in most occasions it is considered to be illusionary in characters, because in true sense of the term there is no semi-peripheral regions. There must be a kind of core and periphery. But this Lenin's, this in terms of highlighting how these imperialist forces exploited the huge majority sections of the people, in his from international relation viewpoint, that we can analyze from this very idea of this core, periphery, and semi-peripheries. Core, that means the developed regions; semi-periphery, that means the developing regions; and this periphery, that means the underdeveloped regions. So in that way, from the ancient period, this divisions, this difference between these things happens. The conditions of the colonies were congenial to the expansion of imperialism. By the 18th century, the ruling Mughal dynasty had become weak. If we talking about this spread of imperialism in South Asian context, we basically highlighted the issues of this Indian subcontinent. So regarding this Indian subcontinent, during this when this British colonial, along with British other colonial forces came to this part of the world, we have this Mughal empires. So this by 18th century, the ruling Mughal dynasty had slowly and gradually they became weak. Similarly, other princely states were also weak, and the quarrels among these petty kingdoms, socio-economic decadence, and the consequent anarchy were the features of this Indian subcontinent at that time. And these imperialist forces take that particular advantages. and they tried to strengthen their positions. Because if we look at the history of this South Asia, and more specifically Indian subcontinent, we might find there are different sorts of princely states, different empires. Say, for example, we have these Mughal empires. Long before these Mughal empires, we had this, Sultanate period. We have these Khilji empires. Uh, you know, so in that way, there are different sorts of dynasties, different sorts of empires were there. And subsequently, when these colonial forces came, that means this modern version of this imperialist forces came to this part of the world, there's a kind of direct clash among these dynasties and empires vis-a-vis these modern imperialistic forces, and subsequently these imperialist forces become triumphant upon this dynasties, and they spread their imperialistic tendencies part of the world. The British and France companies were in the forefront in this particular context. Each one of them tried to oust another from the country. Their enmity in Europe was continued here as well. This led to three wars in India between 1744 and 1763, known as the Carnatic Wars. The English East India Company became victorious in the war. The Battle of Plassey of 1757 and the Battle of Buxar of 1764 brought the Mughal province of Bengal under British control. As a result of the Battle of Buxar, the British obtained Diwani right from the Mughal emperor. Diwani was the authority to collect taxes from the conquered province. The British expanded their power by conquering other provinces and bringing some kingdoms under their control by the subsidiary alliance system. Thus, by 1856, most part of the Indian subcontinent, including Burma, presently you can renamed as Myanmar, were annexed to the British Empire. So, in this way, uh, this imperialism spread in all over this Southeast. These colonial masters exaggerated the weakness of the colonies. They justified their domination as civilizing mission, which we have already discussed, and white man's burden. They claimed that it was a holy mission to civilize the pagan Arabs, Africans, and Asians. That means they considered these people as uncivilized, and subsequently they, justified their activities. So it is necessary for them to justify the civil conquest of the colonies and ill treatment of the native people before the parliament and the world at large. Racial purity and religious supremacy were utilized by them to establish their hegemony. So in that way, slowly and gradually they hegemonize. So, uh, so in this way, this imperialism that spread in South Asia, and slowly and gradually, this imperialistic forces, on the basis of the greed, they expanded their activities. They tried to annex one territory after another, and gradually the entire South Asia came under these imperialistic forces. So I'd like to conclude my discussions with a statement that imperialism is a greed and an aggression against the humanity. With that, I'd like to conclude my today's discussions. In the next class, we're discussing about how these imperialist forces became successful in establishing colonies in this part of the world, and how they can able to consolidate this colonialism in South Asia, and subsequently on the basis of which this nationalism spread in South Asia. That will be discussed in the next class. So thank you very much. Stay safe and stay home. Thank you.